A comparison. Gulags 1955 versus U.S. Prison 2020. The Soviet Gulags, forced labor camps incarcerating anyone who expressed an opinion against the government. What could be further from the land of the free, more at odds with the very foundation of America? And yet, if we look closely, we find more similarities between the U.S. prison system and the Gulags than we would care to admit. Let's start by taking a look at what happened in the Gulags. Initiated in the 1930s, the Gulags were labor camps for prisoners of war or people accused of opposing communism. Prisoners were frequently prosecuted without due process, and even families of people charged as traitors could be locked up in the Gulags without any wrongdoing of their own, guilty by association. Those charged with being a dangerous social element were sentenced to 5 years in the Gulags, while being a counter-revolutionary carried a 10-year sentence. It is estimated that there were 2.5 million people in the Gulag prison camps and colonies in the early 1950s, living in horrific conditions. The camps were overcrowded, with people sleeping wherever they could find space, and mites and skin disease spreading quickly throughout the population. There was no heating and no insulation, and many inmates died from the cold. Clothes were hard to come by, usually acquired from the dead bodies of fellow inmates. The prisoners were fed every day, but barely enough to keep them alive. Each person got the equivalent of 5 slices of bread per day. Many tried to catch rats and insects to supplement their diet, and thousands died of malnutrition. Even those who survived to be released from the Gulags carried the health burden of their years of famine with them. Meanwhile, the guards maintained an atmosphere of terror among the Gulag prisoners. Beatings were common and unrestrained. One former prisoner recounts a sheepdog being set on him, an attack he survived only because he managed to kill the dog. Other times, prisoners were simply dragged out and shot. There are no reliable data on the number of deaths that occurred in the Gulags. Conservative estimates suggest around 1.5 million, but the figure is likely many times higher than that. Second to the guards, the Gulags were run by gangs. Survivors describe how inhumane conditions strip the humanity from people enduring them, leaving man's beast-like side to take control. Women and children, often held in the same camps as men, were frequently subjected to violent attacks or rapes by prisoners or guards. Many women took prison husbands, male prisoners or guards who could offer some level of protection in exchange for sexual favors. While children were often separated from their parents, a woman who was lucky enough to keep her children would have to share her own rations with them. So finding a way to get food from guards or other prisoners was a survival mechanism. As well as serving to keep the population in a state of fear, the Gulags were a source of free labor for the government. Prisoners were assigned heavy manual work, including logging, mining, farming, and construction. They would work 14 hours every day, and temperatures could drop to negative 90 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 68 degrees Celsius during the winter. Hypothermia was common, as was frostbite, which claimed fingers, toes, and noses of thousands of prisoners. Half-starved and using broken tools, the prisoners were hardly an effective labor force, but to the Gulag system, they were expendable. As one set of prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, or disease, another set was shipped in to take their place. The Gulag prisoners also built great construction projects as part of Russia's new infrastructure, including the Road of Bones, so called because the bones of the prisoners that died making it are said to be mixed into the construction. Another former prisoner recalls being sent to the far east of the country, felling timber in the remote region of Siberia. If prisoners tried to escape, the guards didn't even bother chasing them, knowing full well that they would freeze to death in the Arctic conditions before reaching any sign of civilization. Those who survived their sentence in the Gulags were released, but their reputations were marked and they were limited in the jobs they could take. Even after their release, former prisoners were forbidden to speak about their experience and always under watch from the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Union. Fast forward nearly 7 decades, and you may be shocked to find the picture in U.S. prisons is not so different. Over 2.3 million adults were in custody in U.S. jails and prisons at the start of 2020, representing nearly 700 prisoners per 100,000 U.S. citizens. Comparing this figure to Great Britain, Australia, China, and even Mexico, we see that the U.S. is clearly a world leader when it comes to locking up its people. The U.S. prison setup may lack some of the inhumane features of the gulags, like working inmates in Arctic conditions and unscheduled executions, but nevertheless, it comes under justified criticism. And as with Stalin's gulags, it's hard to get a clear picture of what life is like in U.S. prisons. There is a lack of transparency in the system. The guards writing the reports are often the ones accused of assaulting prisoners, either directly or by turning a blind eye to prisoner-on-prisoner violence. Victims are unwilling to tell their stories for fear of being labeled a snitch and suffering repercussions. But from the few stories of former convicts, we can piece together the experience of U.S. prisons, and the picture is not pretty. The conditions inside prisons are unpleasant, as would be expected. There is no air conditioning, so in hot weather, the prisons are stifling. In half of the U.S. states, prisons are operating above the occupancy they were built for, and in several states, the figure reaches 150% capacity, meaning overcrowding is the norm. But worse than the physical conditions is the social environment. Stories from former convicts and prison guards show us that, as demonstrated in the gulags, the psychology of incarcerated people becomes scary really fast. In prisons housing hardened criminals, gang culture rules, and there is little that the guards can do to intervene. Abuse, assault, and drug use are the norm, humanity and empathy are worn away, and in a world of intimidation and coercion, the best advice is to keep a low profile and try not to get involved. The levels of violence between inmates are high. Anything can be made into a weapon, be it screws or pieces of metal ripped from the bed, razor blades or broom handles. The weak become the prey, and newcomers, people with learning disabilities, and sex offenders are particular targets. Rape of child molesters and rapists has also become a ritual in some prisons, one that guards know about but do nothing to stop. Over 70,000 inmates report being raped every year, and it is likely many more go unreported. Indeed, the role of prison guards in the violence in U.S. prisons is a complicated one. There are numerous reports of guards bullying prisoners, either targeting individuals or exercising their superiority over an entire group. Examples include randomly cutting phone access, withholding food, water, and bathroom access, and banning yard time for weeks on end. There are countless stories of guards using verbal abuse to stir up emotions in a prisoner, blaming backtalk as an excuse for using pepper spray, tasers, and beatings. Sexual assault is also common. Female prisoners report being watched in showers by male guards and being afraid to reject sexual advances for fear of repercussions. But, unlike in Stalin's gulags, the guards and U.S. prisoners rarely need to get their hands dirty to perpetuate a culture of fear in their prisoners. Turning a blind eye to violence between inmates, or even facilitating it, is commonplace. Some ex-cons report that the guards didn't patrol in their prisons, preferring to stay in the air-conditioned offices. If a fight kicked off, the guards were oblivious, and any inmate dumb enough to alert the guard or warden found themselves the next target of attack. Even when they were aware an attack was occurring, guards reportedly watched the violence for several minutes before intervening. But then, with some prisons operating with 400 inmates to 2 guards, the reluctance to get into the thick of things is understandable. Other stories report that some guards intentionally placed inmates in cells with their enemies, anticipating a fight, or gave violent prisoners access to a troublemaker to teach them a lesson. As well as numerous unreported injuries, deaths resulting from violent attacks are often written up as being from natural causes rather than murders. And yet, as bad as the social scene in prisons may be, most former prisoners agree that some human interaction is better than none at all. Solitary confinement is used as one of the harshest punishments in U.S. prison, for anything from murdering your cellmate to looking at the guard the wrong way. Across the U.S. prison network, 80,000 people are in the hole at any time. Stuck in tiny cells 7 feet by 11 feet with no windows, their only reprieve being a 90-minute walk in an exercise pen, and deprived of all human contact apart from the guard who brings their food. It's no surprise that solitary has a severe impact on a prisoner's psychological health. And for prisoners who are suffering from illness, mental or physical, medical neglect is a serious cause of illness and death. There are reports of physical injuries being left to rot, seizure patients denied medication, and suicide watch incorporating solitary confinement that makes the prisoner's mental condition deteriorate further. Prisoners and guards who speak out about what they have witnessed or experienced can find themselves in hot water. Inmates who have gang connections on the outside can track down and threaten the family of anyone who snitches on them. Worse, some prisoners recount how they were outed as a snitch by the very guards they asked for protection, and consequently suffered violent attacks from other inmates. Clearly, prisons have an important role in our society, serving as a deterrent against crime, protecting the public from criminals, and rehabilitating convicts so that they don't reoffend. Yet, far from being rehabilitative or corrective, the U.S. prison system gives U.S. ex-cons emerging from incarceration traumatized and in poor mental and physical health, fresh from a subculture far removed from the society we expect them to reintegrate into. And that's our video. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.